we're going to go on to our second speaker, who's Jen Kimmel now. And Jen is from Ireland and USA. And she's going to chat with me, or sort of tell us and share with us about her experience as a trans widow, also experiences with seeking help after being a trans widow, then the ideology reaching her children, Jen, your children, and the captured locality and problems within feminist circles after speaking out. So there's so much. It didn't just stop there with being a trans widow, like the ongoing problems. But thank you so much for being with us, Jen. And so what are your experiences? Maybe starting off about the trans widow bit of it.
So I met my ex-husband in 1995. I was 25 years old and he was 36. And I was working full-time and studying full-time. I was really stressed out, really, really busy. And he was really chill and super relaxing. And he would take me on camping trips and road trips. And we would go to music festivals, and we became very close. I had a great time with him. I had the relaxing time I needed at the time. Now looking back, I realized maybe that was the first time I let my guard down. He made himself useful. And so I knew him for maybe a few months, and he came into a room in his woman's gear, is what he called it. And I was surprised. And then he explained to me about the fact that when he was a child, about 6 years old, he came from quite a troubled home and he ran away. And he came upon his auntie's washing line and took her clothes off the washing line and put them on, and fell asleep and was found later by his grandparents. So he said that he, since that time, used women's clothing as a comfort thing. When he would get depressed or stressed out, he would use dressing up like that as a way to comfort himself. He didn't tell me at the time that it was a fetish or indicate that it was a fetish. He tried to put it into a childhood story, which is common. We know that this is common now with men like this. And if they evoke a child, then a woman will be sympathetic, you know. So it would come back. I was never comfortable with it, to be honest. I just didn't like it. But at the time, that first day, I told him how I had experienced sexual abuse as a kid myself, that I was bisexual, and the bisexual thing came back again and again, because to him, that meant that I was a playground, that I had no real right to reject anything simply because I was attracted to men and women. And it just came back over and over again. But this is part of the thing. They will they will use your sexuality. They will attack your sexuality to control you. This is a common thing I've learned since. At the time, I didn't have all these words for it. But he would stop and pull away from this when I told him that I was uncomfortable. And all throughout our younger time together, I thought I was getting through to him. He would converse with me. I would tell him why it was problematic, why I didn't like if he wanted to dress as a woman when we had sex. He would listen and he would back off. And then it would start back up. And what I realize now is it often started back up when I was vulnerable. So when I was pregnant with my first child, for example, that's when he really started to go dressing a lot. He would take my clothes that no longer fit me and wear those. And I would tell him at the time that things he said hurt me and they were problematic. And I really thought we had a dialogue. So I would build myself and build my boundaries back up, and then I would slowly let them down again. And it became a cycle. And then this went on for, I was with him altogether for about 15 years. So they talk about a frog in a pot, but it was just a slow boil, and it was a cycle. But I do really want to say that these men, they will get you when they know that you have less ability to consent, or when you're compromised. So when I had the kids, I had to choose between protecting them and protecting myself. And that's very often the case with trans widows. In our experiences, the men do kick off when it's the most difficult for us to defend ourselves or to even focus on anything else but our kids.
One of the facts that I read recently, I guess many of us did, is that if a woman becomes ill, gets sort of life-threatening disease or something, then that's a time very, very often a male partner will leave. We'll leave her. So it's like you're really vulnerable and then they leave you. But the similar thing, like you're saying with kids, when you need the most support, you're doing so much work. That was when he sort of ramped up, saw it as an opportunity to be more abusive.
Yeah, and I think they look for look for these times. These men are networked. They do speak with each other, and we are who these men experiment on behind closed doors. I think when I was at my most vulnerable was when, obviously, when I moved to Ireland with him. He had told me that a lot of his depression came from being homesick. And I managed to convince myself that we would be able to be more of a family when we moved over here, because it was pretty much me looking after the kids and him doing his thing. But when we got here, that was it. I'm not sure to this day if he set it up that way, if he planned it for 10 years, I don't know. Possibly. But when we moved here, he was pretty much retired, and that's when the porno was constant. It was hours and hours that he spent online looking at porn, and then that's all he would think about, and that's just all he wanted to do. He did never speak to me in a normal voice. He would always try to speak to me in the feminine voice. I'd kept it away from the kids until that point. When it started that I couldn't, that it was out of the bedroom, that's when it became very alarming, and that's when I became desperate, and I knew I had to get the kids out of there. He would come in his dressed in his lingerie or whatever, but with a dressing gown over it, and come and sit in the sitting room with the kids. And I thought, I have to get out of here. I was absolutely desperate. It was a bad time. So that brings me to, I was able to get away then when I made one friend. So I was able to get out of the house one time for my birthday because his friends pressured him into recognizing it. And I met someone from the town, and she then came to visit, which he did not like, of course. And it was just that one woman, gave me the strength. And of course, he was calling her a feminist and a lesbian. And, any woman that would say no to men like this, they hate. So he was calling her all kinds of names. But I did get out with the help of her and a domestic violence service. And I have to say they did not know how to deal with my specific situation, but they relied on a coercive control model. And that's very much what it is with these guys a lot of the time. So, but when I first got away, it was very hard for me to find therapy, and I needed it because I had PTSD. There was a lot of sexual abuse and I was not in good shape. But I could not find a therapist that did not want to focus on him and his journey. And the therapists seemed to be very uncomfortable with what I was trying to get help about. And domestic violence groups I joined, I was actually removed from one for being transphobic because I explained that my ex. I relied, while I was still with him, I relied very much on a women's aid hotline in Ireland, and it was incredibly helpful. Since then, women's aid has really been captured. The chair of women's aid called for women like me, well, any woman countering any of this, but women like me to have our political and legal representation removed. So it's and I wrote it down. Rape crisis. I rang rape crisis because I do occasionally get PTSD when it gets overwhelming. If I get threats through my front door now because I put my face out there. And when I rang them one time when I was in bad shape, I was told, when I mentioned that my ex was trans-identifying, I was stopped and told I needed to remember that all genders rape and abuse. This kind of thing is a priority for a rape crisis line in Ireland now. And when I got out, community groups were essential for me. So there's a local community group that reaches out to vulnerable parts of the community, and it has a wee charity shop. I volunteered in that charity shop several days a week. I was able to meet locals and really get my roots down here and meet people. That organization has hired a trans rights activist to run it. So this man and his friend, when I had first spoken out, they found out that I supported JK Rowling, and they wanted to lecture me about that. And I tried to tell them, well, this is really a complicated matter, and I had a really bad experience, and it's very personal to me. And they weren't having it. They lambasted me. And then one showed up at my house with a book called Whipping Girl by a man called Serrano, which basically says, if you want to be gang raped and abused, you must be a woman. This is what they brought to my house. These guys are now, they run a week-long festival in my remote locality. It's translated into Pride in the Irish language. So I'm in a very remote place, and there's a week-long festival started by these two men pretty much to counter whatever conversation I've started in my area. And people they have no idea what's really behind this. Especially since COVID happened last year, they were so happy to have any kind of liveliness in the town. Everybody was out happy to celebrate Pride, happy to show that they weren't homophobic. And it's gutting to me, because I see the people in my town being used because they really have no idea what they're really backing, because they were carrying that. It was not the Pride flag, it's the Pride, I think it's called a progress flag, where it has trans and intersex. And these humongous flags like this were my entire town, every business in the town was covered in these flags.
This is just amazing, isn't it? It's a small little town in Ireland.
Really remote, yeah. And it's starting again this year, and they are going to get funding. It's going to be big because it's something called uterus. It's because it's in the Irish language, because Ireland, we want stuff to start happening again. So everybody was so happy to go to to have the crack. They just had no idea. Meanwhile, I know that there's at least 2 girls in my town who are starting to desist. And if you pull away from this, you're a traitor. The pressure that's on these young girls, and now it's going to be the flags are going to be everywhere. How much more difficult is it going to be for these girls and their parents?
And when you say desist, is that to not believe in it, in the genderism?
No, one stopped wearing a binder, which we know is very bad.
So they were sort of thinking that they were boys, or So detransitioning, or desisting. Wow, and they're going to get in trouble, you think, then?
I just think it's going to be more difficult for them. Their parents are petrified to speak about it at all, because we know that the young people are taught that you don't discuss this. And this was part of the reason why I don't know that I ever would have put myself out there if I didn't see all 3 of my kids being captured, even though I got away years later, utterly captured. The main thing was you do not talk about this at all. So then, my kids began to see me as the enemy, very embarrassing. My youngest was frightened. He was afraid that someone was going to hurt us because I dared speak about these issues. It's to this day, it's the same,
So was that it? This was in school and in the local community, sort of like youth groups and stuff?
My kids are homeschooled. Yeah. So
wow.
Even though I did my best to kind of teach them about boundaries and consent, but and I live in this remote place, they still got them. They're in the arts, and the arts are utterly captured, so everybody in their theater group will identify as non-binary or some kind of trans or demi something or poly, even though the youngest guys have never even dated anyone, but they think they're in a poly relationship. Basically, they just have a lot of really interesting friends, but they're using this language and they don't even know what it is, and they're talking, 14-years are talking about who's a top and who's a bottom, but what they really mean is who's outspoken and who's rather meek. It's everywhere, and you can't. As if I tried to talk to a basic townsperson about what's going on and why this festival that's happening is an issue, I would look crazy, because there's just so many things about it. I would not even know where to start.
Yeah,
And
I
it
mean,
was
it's making me think a bit that in Ireland, with the decline of the Catholic Church, and that, you know, there's sort of people don't like the church anymore because of all the paedophile scandals, and they just don't like it. It sounds like they've all just, the whole community have just all gone onto this new religion thing.
that's what they say, you know. I mean, there's a bit of overcorrection going on, you know, and people like us in my town, people do not want to be homophobic. They want to move along, they want to show progress, but they're being duped. I hate it. You know, they don't know what these two boys, these two men that started this festival are really about. If I tried to explain it to them, they would pull away, because people don't necessarily want to know about an individual's woman's experience with this. And this,
yeah, I was going to ask that too, because you've actually had experience, and you would think that some of these people you've had contact with would say, that's really interesting, we want to find out more. What is your experience? But nobody really did that.
Yeah, it would be really difficult, though, to bring, and that's part of the reason I was so stuck with them in the beginning. It's a difficult thing to talk about. There's a lot of sexual abuse with it. It makes people uncomfortable if you talk about my specific experience. And that goes back to trans widows. You know, so many people are talking about women's spaces and protecting women's spaces. But then if an individual woman tries to tell what happened, it does tend to put people off. I think people want to keep women want to keep a certain amount of distance from it. So they think that could never happen to me. And they don't want to hear about it. It's like dirty laundry. But it's essential, I think, that we hear individual women's experiences, because these men, as I said, you know, a woman's space is also our home. And I make a joke, you know, the call is coming from inside the house. It's from some horror movie. I don't know which one. I keep seeing memes about it, but it's already in our homes. This porn is in our home 24 hours a day. And these men, they do, you know, they're trying to dismantle boundaries, and they're trying to take apart what it is to be a woman. Well, they'll practice on an individual woman. And these men, when you're in a relationship with them, they take you down to pieces. They wait until you're vulnerable, and they attack your sexuality, which everyone knows from like the Catholic Church. If they can control your sexuality, they can control you. So they just take you down to pieces, and then they try to cobble some of those pieces to themselves and say that they were always theirs, and then they'll try to dispose of the rest. I mean, they just really want to plow over women, and they practice on their partners. It's a bit of a microcosm, you know, to what's happening in the wider world. And that's why I think our stories are important to hear, because we can tell you a lot. There's a new focus now where they say, well, this is a feminist issue. It's separate from what's happening to the kids. First, we have to focus on these kids and take care of these kids. And the feminist thing is the feminists can do their thing, but we're going to help the kids. You can't separate it. It's all connected. You know, if you're going to attack women and you're going to harm women, you're going to harm the kids, because we take care of the kids. By and large, we're the ones looking after the kids.
Yeah.
You know,
so can you explain that? Who's saying this about it? We should take, are they just saying, oh, well, we don't mind the stuff about women, but we just don't want any harm done to kids? Is that what you're saying?
I think when people try to separate the two things, I think a problem starts there. I think it's all the one issue.
Yeah.
And there are people saying, look, you know, that's a feminist, the thing that's happening to women, it's a feminist issue. But the emergency, the crisis is with the kids, and there is certainly a crisis with kids, but it's all connected.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
You know, they're using kids as shields. But if we address what's happening with women, the kids will be protected. It's all together. If you divide it in that way, it's not the way to go, because mothers are being devalued. You know, kids aren't listening to their mothers. Their mothers are, you know, mothers like me, I'm the enemy now.
Yeah.
You know, kids,
and how's that gone with your kids? So how do you manage to talk to them now? What
I have to be, you know, I have to walk on eggshells, but you know, I have to persevere. They will get it one day. I'm really happy that even though they sort of see me as the enemy, or they're sick of it, or they don't get it, they have great boundaries themselves. I raised them, and so I don't worry about my own that much. My oldest is still rather captured, but I have faith he will eventually come around. But you know, when I hear them talking to their friends, they might buy into all this language, but they know very much about consent. They will not stand for violations. So it's difficult that my kids don't really have much respect for what I'm doing, but
Yeah. And how about, and then you also mentioned about feminist circles, that you've had problems in feminist circles.
I haven't had problems in feminist circles as such, but I think the problem is just that separation where, this is a feminist issue and taking care of the kids is something else, and it's a priority, and separating that, I just think it's all the same thing. It's a whole.
Yeah. And what about organizations? Are there organizations that you're in touch with or in Ireland that are growing up for trans widows?
Oh, not for trans widows. No, there's not a lot being done. All the violence against women and girls organizations are thoroughly captured, and I don't see much happening about that. But I'm not in touch with everyone all the time. I have to back away a lot of the time because it gets overwhelming, because I'm dealing with it right at my front door now with these festival goers. We had a thing years ago, it was called the Friday Pint, and the middle-aged women would get together on a Friday and have a pint. And I've just learned that they're not so sure about inviting me now because I'm known as anti-gay. I've been openly bisexual since I've been an adult. It has absolutely nothing to do with being anti-gay. But this is what that festival has done, because I can't really defend myself without looking like a loony to people. It's also complicated. So it's all boiled down to Jenny's anti-gay because she has a problem with this, it's really the furthest thing.
Yeah. And I suppose it doesn't really matter if to them that it's not true, because if they feel that they're being loyal to the new dogma,
they don't want to take the risk either way.
And then you're the outcast, and they can prove their loyalty by ostracizing you.
Yeah. And there are some people who heard what I had, women who've heard what I had to say, and I told them who was behind this festival, but at the end of the day, they didn't want to miss the party. And so, they all joined in, and I felt very isolated. I didn't have anybody that will have a partner, and he's great, and he's a rock, and he's right behind me, but I didn't have much. Everybody else just wanted to join in the party. They didn't really matter much to the one woman said to me, well, just go to the party and don't let them win. But it's just counter to everything I stand for. Another thing I wanted to mention, besides the girls that are desisting, is Munchausen. There are people that I know are not quite right and are using their kids to be part of this. I know there's one woman in my town who's absolutely has, I don't know how to pronounce the word, Munchausen, I think, by proxy.
I think so, yeah.
Last year, I saw that she was involved in the festival, and I thought, oh no, her youngest. And sure enough, her youngest now is identifying as trans, just since last year when this festival happened. It's just such a dangerous thing, and I wish I could somehow explain this to the people who are so gung-ho about it, but it's just impossible. It's just so hard to watch when I feel powerless about it. But but then I was saying there's a lot happening in Ireland. There's a group called the Countess. There's a group called the Irish Women's Lobby. There's Women's Space Ireland. There's individual women. There are a lot of women involved in fighting back against this. So, I'm not hopeless.